With the latest release of GNOME, I keep hearing all this talk about a so-called GNOME OS, and it seems like a lot of people just are not reading past the title whatsoever, because I've been seeing a lot of, comments on these articles and videos saying that this is such a terrible idea. Why is the GNOME Foundation trying to make an operating system? And it's going to make people abandon other distros like Ubuntu. Why would they want to do this? And that's not the point of this at all. So recently, the GNOME Foundation has been sending out ISOs to journalists and developers. I didn't get one. I'll leave someone else's link down below if you want to try it out for yourself. And this ISO is a custom Linux distribution based entirely around GNOME. And the interesting thing about it is it's not actually based on any existing distro. It's its own custom distro. It's not based on Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, anything like that. It is completely custom. And because of this, it doesn't have a package manager. Now, you can install Flatpaks on it, but there's no traditional package manager on it like you'd see on a regular distro. But this is actually intended by design, and this isn't actually a problem. But before we get into what's happening right now with GNOME Orbis, we need to understand that this custom GNOME OS isn't actually new. In fact, it's actually been around for about 8 years in a completely different form called GNOME Continuous. So basically, GNOME Continuous is a project that exists to solve one very, very simple problem, and that is that the GNOME designers and developers need to actually be able to try what they're designing as it's actually being implemented, because it's basically useless to try and design code without some sort of testing framework. And doing that job from a custom development environment fits that job absolutely perfectly. So for GNOME Continuous, the people who should be using it are machines, because this system was very much designed to meet the needs of automated testing, and also human GNOME developers and testers who want to see GNOME as it was a few minutes ago from Git master. So this means that GNOME Continuous was not designed to be stable, because maybe someone will, push up a patch that, breaks something and everything dies. So GNOME Continuous was by no means made to be stable. Also, it wasn't made to be a desktop operating system, because there were no security patches. Using this system would be incredibly irresponsible for anyone outside of people who want to test it or who actually want to develop the system. So like with this new GNOME OS, GNOME Continuous is using a system called OS Tree, which basically allows you to make a custom Linux distribution, and then as you want to do update integration, you can actually pull it in Git repositories, build them, and then ship them as a new ISO. Now, with GNOME Continuous, one of the main non-goals of this system was not to actually replace a general purpose GNU/Linux distribution for a number of reasons. GNOME Continuous is not intended to be the build of GNOME inside of GNOME. For example, JHBuild will remain actively maintained for developers to build subsets of GNOME, such as GTK Plus on top of existing distributions. So GNOME Continuous was never actually made to be a desktop distribution. But that did not stop journalists back in 2012 from making articles that made it seem like it was going to be, where you have this one right here from Tech Radar called "What on Earth is GNOME OS? There's more upheaval to come in Linux's most controversial desktop environment." And this basically says the same thing that I've just said. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see right here, GNOME OS will be a Linux distro, but it isn't going to replace traditional distributions. But if you're just going to read the title, it does make it seem like, oh, GNOME OS is going to be this big new Linux distribution that's going to take over the desktop. But it wasn't that 8 years ago, but maybe it's changed now. But as of 5 months ago, that doesn't seem to be the case. So over on Reddit, someone asked the question, who wants a GNOME OS? And one of the members of the GNOME Foundation replied by saying, GNOME OS has always been a dream to achieve in our community, but it's not really possible unless an existing distro decides to merge with us. Maintaining an operating system is a lot of work. You only have to look at how many active people work on the distros as it is. There are a lot of wheels there that you need to tweak. So at least as of 5 months ago, the GNOME Foundation did not want to do this, but maybe they managed to build an operating system in 5 months and actually make something for the desktop. And that takes us to now, and I think this is where some of the confusion is actually coming from. So back in July, there was a GNOME conference, and one of the talks was focused on running a GNOME OS on real hardware. So one of the things I didn't mention about GNOME Continuous previously is that GNOME Continuous was really only remotely stable inside of a virtual machine, but with the release of GNOME 3.38 Orbis, which as of the recording of this video should be the latest version, and due to efforts from the GNOME Foundation and CodeThink, it is now actually possible to actually run this on real hardware, and also because of things like Flatpak and OS Tree, it's basically making it feel more like a real Linux distribution, but that's still not the point of it. So even in 2020, GNOME OS is part of the project's continual testing investment and can be booted on real systems with UEFI via systemd boot, and systemd is leveraged throughout the system. Now, the version that is being sent to journalists is a little bit different from the version that is just being used internally by the GNOME Foundation. So the version that's being sent to journalists is basically a stable release of GNOME. So it's GNOME 3.38 or GNOME 3.39. It's something they can use and actually go and explore this new platform, but it's not a desktop operating system, at least in the normal sense. It obviously is still an operating system, but it is mainly a testing platform. So if you're a journalist or if you're a YouTuber and you actually want to make content on the new features in GNOME, it's going to be much harder to do so if you have to wait until it's available in your distribution, especially if you're running something like Ubuntu. Obviously, if you're on, say, Arch Linux, the newest version of GNOME is going to be there much quicker, but if you're not running that, it's going to be much harder to actually get that content out in a timely manner. So having this distribution where it has all of the new GNOME features and the entire GNOME desktop, every single application that comes with it, rather than you just picking and choosing which ones you want to have, this makes it way easier to actually make content on GNOME, and in that regards, this is actually an amazing idea. Now, obviously, I have no interest in running this myself because I think GNOME and just most desktop environments are fairly boring. I'd much rather build something up from scratch myself, but I can still definitely appreciate it for the people who actually do want to go and do that testing with the latest GNOME features. And on the developer side, it makes it much easier to test and implement new features without having to worry about inconsistencies between distros, because let's say you're trying to write GNOME 3.39 and you want to test it on, say, Ubuntu or Fedora. Well, there's no guarantee that the dependency that the newest version of GNOME actually needs will be available on that distro, whereas if you're using, say, a testing platform, obviously your testing platform is going to have all the dependencies that you actually need. And because this is a complete GNOME environment, it's not just picking and choosing which applications it wants to have, it also allows you to do things like integration testing, because if you don't have everything available at once, your integration test will not be valid. Obviously, you can do like a partial integration test, but if you want to fully test the GNOME desktop environment, you need to have all of the tools available at the same time. And if you're just a regular user of GNOME, maybe you want to test out the latest features before it actually hits your distro, because if you're on something like, say, Ubuntu probably isn't going to get the latest version of GNOME until you actually get another major release. Now, I know it was a little bit different with Orbis, but most of the time that seems to be the case, and you may still be a couple of months away from the next Ubuntu release, so you might have to wait a really long time to use it. And if you want to test out GNOME beforehand, maybe then you'll decide to move to something that moves a little bit quicker than Ubuntu does. So unless you're a developer, this is basically a marketing tool disguised as an operating system. It's not a desktop operating system, and that's not an insult whatsoever. It's simply not the point of it. And honestly, I think this is a absolutely brilliant marketing tool, because here I am talking about this, and I don't care about GNOME whatsoever. So if you just read the title of an article, I can sort of understand why some people might think this is like the KDE Neon of GNOME, where it is the, I guess, officially recognized distribution of that desktop environment. But at least for right now, that is not what GNOME OS actually is. Maybe one day it will be that, but at least for now, GNOME OS is a testing platform and a marketing tool, and that's pretty much all it needs to be. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, but before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Corbinian, Andrew Craig, Nathan Monster, Joseph Pittity, Road, Tony, Brennan, Donald, John, Marek, Mikkel, Nate Dog, Nephite, Tees, and Zilva. If you want to go and support my work, there'll be some links down below to my Patreon, LibrePay, Subscribestar, all of that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and I've got this channel available on Library, Odyssey, BitTube, and some other platforms as well, if you want to watch my content somewhere that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.